On the occasion of celebrating his first Mass, is that okay? As a priest on the 31st of July 1936, the feast day of St. Ignatius, Hans Urs von Balthasar was presented with a copy of Pierre Mandanas' Dante le Theologian by one of his 6 closest student friends, Bertold Neinhardt. In this book, Mandanas, celebrated Thomist and the great Dominican medieval historian of his generation, interprets Dante as a theologian, the Commedia's ultimate purpose as the glory of the Lord, and his Beatrice as representing symbolically the beauty, goodness, and truth of the Christian supernatural order. How fitting, one might think, that at the beginning of his priestly ministry, Balthasar, who would subsequently attempt to develop a Christian theology in the light of the third transcendental, should read Mandanas' volume on Dante, in which one can arguably find in seminal form the scope of his magisterial trilogy on beauty, the glory of the Lord, goodness, the theodrama, and truth, the theologic. And yet, Balthasar does not cite Mandanas' volume at any point and claim to know of no reliable work on Dante's theology in the strictest sense. In interpreting Dante, moreover, he goes on to reject entirely the scholastic approach of Mandanas. At the same time, Dante is central to Balthasar's historical vision of theological aesthetics. Dante represents, Balthasar summarizes, the painful experience of the collapse of monastic and clerical theology into a lay theology. It is indeed Dante who, for Balthasar, inaugurates a new lay style of theology in the vernacular, a new existential theology, displacing thereby the clerical and Latin theology of the schools. Given Dante's pivotal role in Balthasar's exposition of his theological aesthetics, it is perhaps surprising that Balthasar's treatment of Dante has received little scholarly attention. Dante scholars have largely ignored it, while theologians, even Balthasarians, have made very few references to it. Today, I have time only to present 2 of the 4 parts of my own critical reappraisal. I will first analyze contextually Balthasar's presentation of Dante. Secondly, I will chart the relationship between Balthasar's understanding of Dante and the distinguishing features of his theological aesthetics as a whole. In the other 2 parts of the paper, which are outlined, there's a 1-page handout that you should have on your tables. They're outlined in the handout, and I'm happy to refer to that in questioning or after the session. In those 2 sessions, I consider Mandanas' antithetical presentation of Dante as a scholastic theologian and allegorical poet, as well as Mandanas' account of natural and supernatural beauty in Dante's Commedia, an account which may well have influenced Balthasar, even as his own theological aesthetics took a radically different turn. So, part 1, from scholastic to existential theology, Balthasar's Dante. While Dante does not feature in Balthasar's theoretical account of theological aesthetics in Seeing the Form, Volume 1, Balthasar gives precedence to Dante as the first example of what he calls lay styles of theology in Volume 2 or Volume 3 in the English edition. For Balthasar, Dante marks the dividing line in his history of theological aesthetics between the clerical and Latin style of theology, represented by Irenaeus, Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, Anselm and Bonaventure, and the lay and vernacular style of theology, represented by Dante, St. John of the Cross, Pascal, Harman, Solovyov, Hopkins, and Peggy. In this first section, I analyse 4 key features of Balthasar's treatment of Dante, which I think are particularly significant to the project of his theological aesthetics as a whole. First, for Balthasar, Dante's lay style of theology is entirely original, a new or third theology, rejecting timeless scholasticism and the Latin language in favour of history and reality and the vernacular. Secondly, Dante's Commedia represents a personal, mystical vision, not a fiction according to the allegory of the poets. Third, and relatedly, Dante's conversion to the laity, like his conversions to history and to the vernacular, foreground his own personality, his own destiny, his own eros, creating the conditions for an authentic Christian experience. And finally, Dante's depiction of his love for Beatrice creates a new principle, utterly unprecedented in the history of theology, namely that the finite human love of man for woman is not sacrificed, as by Augustine, on the altar of the classical via negativa, but instead becomes the very means of ascent to God. First of all, then, Balthasar makes very strong claims for Dante's originality, tellingly entitling the first section on the poet, Untrod Paths. In writing the Commedia in the vernacular, Dante was, according to Balthasar, taking a momentous step in the history of mankind, inheriting while simultaneously leaving behind Latin scholasticism. Balthasar interprets Dante's election of the vernacular indeed as a choice of history and action over timelessness and contemplation, associating the latter negatively with scholasticism. Characterizing Aquinas as more of a philosopher than a theologian, Balthasar claims that after 1300, no theologian writing subsequently in Latin made a really significant contribution to the history of the human spirit, with the partial exception he allows of Nicholas of Cusa's experiments in theology, and the successive generations of commentators on St. Thomas up to the Enlightenment are summarily dismissed as manifestly imitators of their master. For Balthasar, rather than celebrating Aquinas and scholasticism in the heaven of Christian wisdom, Paradiso 10-14, Dante is instead demoting them and bidding them a valedictory farewell. When Dante meets scholasticism in the heights of paradise, in the sun, in the lowest of the higher spheres, the impression left on him by the round dance of the twice 12 teachers of wisdom, the two groups led by Thomas and Bonaventure, is of the subtle interlocking mechanism of a clock, of a holy mill. Here, Balthasar's emphasis on the mechanism of the clock analogy correlates with his derogatory association of scholasticism with a sterile and essentialist worldview, a worldview which he contrasts with Dante's new way, giving alleged primacy to concrete personal existence. Indeed, Balthasar interprets the unnamed and implicit third ring of Christian intellectuals to allude to Dante's new theological path. It is not inconceivable, he writes, that Dante considered himself to be the originator of this new third theology. Secondly, for Balthasar, the Commedia is not a fictional work composed according to the allegory of the poets, with a primarily ethical purpose, but the unique and personal report of a mystical experience of God and of reality. It is, he says, the result of an unimaginably exalted grace granted to Dante, a living man, a citizen of the world, to proceed through the kingdom of the world to come. Others may have been caught up to God in ecstasy, but no one else has undertaken a methodological exploration of paradise or acquired esperienza of the hereafter. Dante indicates proleptically for Balthasar the experiential exploration of reality of modern times. Balthasar thus follows a predominant, but in my view entirely misplaced, 20th century emphasis on the literal truth of the Commedia. Specifically, he appears to follow the dominant influence of Bruno Nardi, who argued that the literal sense of Dante's poem is literally true, and that Dante was shown in vision hell, purgatory, and paradise as they truly are in reality, and consequently that Dante spoke as a divinely inspired prophet and considered his poem not a literary fiction, but the report of a true mystical vision. Balthasar was also influenced in this respect by Romano Guardini. Guardini is convinced, Balthasar comments, that a genuine visionary experience that reaches into the beyond forms the point of departure for the Divine Comedy and provides the poet with the particular comprehensive state of the things he sees. This makes the vision credible both in the concrete and in relation to the eschaton. That's Balthasar and Guardini. Following Guardini's lead, Balthasar argues that Dante inaugurates in his Commedia a new existential theology on this visionary basis, as he underlines. What Dante reports is not conjecture, but first-hand experience, and just to recall it makes him shudder and tremble. Again, following Guardini, Balthasar explicitly equates the reality of what Dante has seen, which is of course completely objective, it is not in any sense a mere function of the subject's power of imagination, with the visions in the Johannine Apocalypse. Thirdly, Balthasar underlines Dante's alleged conversion to the laity, a conversion which follows on, he suggests, from Dante's conversions to the vernacular and to history. For Dante, conversion to the laity means turning away from the scholastic study of essences to reflection on the reality and the conditions of the possibility of an authentic Christian existence. Indeed, and this in contrast to the mendicant orders and the mysticism of the day, of an ethico-political existence in the world. From Dante to our own times, this has been the route taken by every theology that has made its mark on history. Balthasar's antithesis between authentic Christian existence and scholasticism, and his contrast in this respect between Dante and the mendicant orders, which for Dante himself at least were, if anything, too passionately concerned with the ethico-political sphere, is questionable at best. But this underpins Balthasar's very definition of conversion to the laity, to which he demarcates three further components. It deals with his own personality, his own destiny, his own eros, three immensely portentous issues. Balthasar sets out Dante's personality as in extreme contrast to Thomas Aquinas, with whom personality completely and intentionally disappears. And by this, Balthasar appears to mean that Aquinas did not write a Confessions, whereas Dante places himself as the central protagonist in his Commedia. Balthasar's emphasis on Dante's destiny, meanwhile, seems to denote, again, simply the narrative form of the Commedia, that it is written in the first person. It is Eros, though, which for Balthasar is the third and most important aspect of Dante's conversion to the laity. And it is in relation to Dante's love for Beatrice that Balthasar makes his most extravagant claims for Dante's originality as a lay theologian. There appeared, for the first time in Christian theology, the theme of individual, personal, and faithful love. Dionysius and Bonaventure had indeed found divine eros in the cosmos, and in his Confessions, Augustine had recognized and confessed personal eros. But the first was not personal, and the second was not in the least degree theological. But this is the claim that Dante makes for Beatrice. The thoroughly earthly love of the Vita Nova is carried as far as the heights of heaven. Indeed, it is extolled as the motive power for the whole journey through the hereafter. The love which began on earth between two human beings is not denied, is not bypassed in the journey to God. It is not, as was always naturally enough, hitherto the case, sacrificed on the altar of the classical via negativa. No. It is carried right up to the throne of God, however transformed and purified. This is utterly unprecedented in the history of Christian theology. The foundation of Balthasar's account is, of course, Beatrice's historicity, and Balthasar directly echoes Etienne Gilson's summary and withering critique in the first part of Dante et la Philosophie of Mandonet's purely symbolic interpretation of Beatrice. By insisting upon Beatrice's historicity against the purely symbolic or allegorical interpretations of dusty academics, Balthasar is following the dominant realist strand in the late 19th and 20th century reception of Dante's Beatrice. While for the symbolist, Dante represents his love for theology through the poetic figure of his love for a woman, whether this woman be purely fictitious or identified with a historical woman. For the realists, such as Gilson, Dante's earthly love for a particular woman, Beatrice Portinari, and not just what Beatrice signifies, theology, is itself his pathway to God and the very lifeblood of the Commedia. In this respect, Balthasar also draws explicitly on Charles Williams' romantic theology or theology of romantic love. As Charles Williams rightly saw, Balthasar comments, Dante's earthly love for Beatrice transcends the whole Neoplatonic scheme of via positiva, negativa eminentiae. For Williams, Dante's love for Beatrice is a particular mode of the general way of the affirmation of images as a method of progress towards the in-godding of man. Likewise for Balthasar, the human being Beatrice Portinari stands for the relationship between created reality and God. This is Dante's greatest intuition in theological aesthetics, and as such it can serve for all subsequent repetitions or variations. Anyone who sees the primordial power with which Dante grasps the problem of Christian eros and resolves it in the form of Beatrice will, as far as theology is concerned, scarcely experience anything or deeper or purer beyond that in Claudel. Indeed, Claudel's ode to Dante can be seen to bear this witness. Balthasar fully endorses that is, Paul Claudel's interpretation of the role of Eros in Christian life as essentially that of Dante. Indeed, it is its later repetition and witness. For Balthasar, this is Dante's crowning achievement as a lay theologian, leading to a new Christian reconciliation of Eros and Agape. Beatrice's purificatory and redemptive power in the end remains unique. She alone leads from Eros to Agape, or rather she is that Eros that is transfigured into Agape. Dante established for the first time the principle that for the sake of infinite love, it is not necessary for the Christian to renounce finite love. And it is this principle that, he claims, justifies the life and work of Dante. So, my second section, Balthasar's theological aesthetics. Balthasar's interpretation of the life and work of Dante is programmatic and strikingly parallels his sense of his own life and work. Arguably, indeed, Balthasar interprets Dante as having achieved in the early 14th century what he sought to achieve again in the mid-20th century. As Dante apparently abandoned Latin scholasticism, so Balthasar sought to overthrow the Leonine scholasticism, the sawdust Thomism principally conducted in Latin, of his day. As Dante ushered in a new third theology in the vernacular, so Balthasar's raising of the bastions sought to clear the way for his own new theology, a theological aesthetic, in the vernacular. As Dante's Commedia is for Balthasar a personal mystical vision, so he would insist methodologically on the personal mystical graces of, in his case, Adrian von Speer, as valid and inseparable from his own constructive theology. As Balthasar presents Dante as an exile and misunderstood outsider, so Balthasar would live for much of his life as an exile in opposition to the institutional church. Balthasar writes that after 1300, the date of the Commedia's narrative, and for Balthasar of Dante's mystical vision, it is primarily laity who, out of an adequate theological culture and with a more powerful vision and deeper creative insight than the theologians of the schools, carry forward the concern and guarantee its effectiveness with a breadth and depth which escapes the professional theologians. For Balthasar, this would presumably apply more especially and specifically after 1900. Thus, in relation to his own time, Balthasar contrasts the run-of-the-mill clergy and their narrowing down of Christian theology to academic specialization and the timeless pursuit of the schools with the great upholders of Christian spirituality, who not seldom find themselves to be and behave like representatives of the ecclesiastical opposition and have to take on themselves the corresponding fate of the exiled, the misunderstood, the outlawed, and whose burning concern is the understanding of revelation in the context of the history of the world and the actual present. Balthasar's new theological aesthetics lays claim to the center of theology. It is the only valid approach, while the approach is founded on the cosmos or on world history on the one hand, or on anthropology on the other, can be presented as secondary and complementary at best. At the foundation of Balthasar's theological aesthetics, indeed, is a rejection of a human or natural criterion for beauty, as well as for ontology or anthropology. Balthasar's own approach to beauty corresponds analogously, instead, to Karl Barth's approach to natural theology. In our fallen state, our reason and our perception of beauty with their internal criteria are unfitting standards for appreciating Christ, the incarnate Word, and therefore we must take our very notion of beauty from the incarnate Word itself. While Balthasar notes Francis Kovac's elucidation of a Thomistic philosophical aesthetics, Balthasar is sceptical of any supposedly objective or philosophical criterion of beauty, and he implicitly accepts the subjectivity of aesthetic judgment as a relative matter of taste. Balthasar also criticizes the approach to specifically Christian art exemplified by François-René de Chateaubriand, for whom the world of revelation does not bring with itself its own criterion and its own beauty, a criterion and a beauty by which man, the world, and culture could measure themselves. Instead, the criterion is of this worldly, human, and cultural beauty. This leads in turn to Balthasar's key distinction between theological aesthetics, that is, the attempt to do aesthetics at the level and with the methods of theology, and aesthetic theology, which he sees as betraying and selling out theological substance to the current viewpoints of an inner worldly theory of beauty. In setting out his theological aesthetics, Balthasar rejects Thomistic anthropology then, and establishes a new anthropology based on his personal and, in my view, rather quixotic understanding of the Christ form. Balthasar rejects both sides of what he sees as a dualistic form or matter approach to beauty. The original of beauty lies not in a disembodied spirit which looks about for a field of expression, nor is it a spiritless body which somehow throws itself together through an inexplicable play of material forces. The first Balthasar equates with Plato, who made that which was original the derivative as something within a wholly separate, abstract and absolute realm of the spirit, while the second presumably refers to any kind of strictly materialist philosophy. But, crucially, Balthasar does not take the Thomistic Aristotelian via media of classical realism, according to which, while the entire Platonic world of archetypal ideas is sheer fiction, at least on one level, there does exist in every existing thing an intelligible and immaterial element which Aristotle calls form, in virtue of which it possesses a specific nature or essence. Instead, Balthasar, while noting that Aristotle remained loyal to the phenomenon as such, misleadingly turns to a limit which has nothing per se to do with his natural philosophy or anthropology at all, but rather to his lack of supernatural revelation, namely his inability to understand or construct a promise of human wholeness beyond life on earth. Having thus falsely counterpoised Plato and Aristotle, Balthasar situates his novel anthropology of the Christ form as that via media, while he characterizes all Thomistic scholastic philosophy and theology with its concern for the essences of things, as well as all who have put allegory, in other words, discourse about something else, in place of symbol, in other words, true sign, as deviant forms of Platonism. Balthasar rejects, that is, the Thomistic understanding of the human body, the matter as revealing the human soul, the form, and the image of God in man as residing in man's intellect and will, and thus his soul. Instead, man, spirit and body, must become a symbol, a true sign of what he sees as the Christ form. For to be a Christian is precisely a form. The image of existence is here illuminated by the archetype of Christ and set to work by the free might of the Creator Spirit with all the sovereignty of one who need not destroy the natural in order to achieve his spiritual goal. For this reason, however, it is clear that in any age, and most especially in our own, the Christian will realize his mission only if he truly becomes this form which has been willed and instituted by Christ. When it is achieved, Christian form is the most beautiful thing that may be found in the human realm. Christ is not, as in Aquinas, a bridge maker, pontifex to God, through whom we come to know the mystery of the Trinity, and nor is Christ's humanity in any sense simply the conjoined instrument of the Logos. Rather, Christ is the becoming visible and experienceable of the divine Trinity. The glory of the Lord is nowhere, not for a single instant, Balthasar says, separated from the Lamb, nor is the light of the Trinity. Whoa, is that just cutting me off because I'm talking for too long? I think I've still got 5 minutes. Nor is the light of the Trinity divorced from the light of Christ, the incarnate Son. As Ada Nichols comments, this is Balthasar's, I would add, allegedly, Catholic version of Barth's Christocentralizing revolution of theology in the church dogmatics. While Balthasar makes Christ the centre of theology and the focal point of theological aesthetics, there is the obvious problem that, outside of personal mystical experience, we cannot see the historical Jesus Christ himself. This is, in my view, where Balthasar's literal interpretation of Dante's love for Beatrice is so significant for the development, or at least the justification and articulation, of his theological aesthetics in practice. Dante's Beatrice perfectly exemplifies Balthasar's theological or Christological aesthetics and the new lay style of existential theology, whereby a particular Christian makes visible in their very existence the Christ form. For the role of the Christian, according to Balthasar, is to become receptive to the Christ form and then to manifest this form to others. Such creative form, then, is God's work, and the work of man only insofar as he makes himself available to the divine action without opposition, accepting, allowing God to act, concurring in his work. Such art becomes visible in the Christian sphere in the life forms of the chosen. In its exact sense, prophetic existence is the existence of a person who, in faith, has been divested of any intent to give himself shape, who makes himself available as the matter for the divine action. God's lordship and his glory in what is other than himself in man is accomplished by Christ, who fashions glory out of humanity and the cosmos. This glory is not just this worldly, instead it is the result of Christ pouring out his grace on individual men and women such that they may reveal and become mediators of a perception of and enrapturing in him. Balthasar thereby conflates any traditional distinction between natural, created, and supernatural beauty, because God, the ineffable ground of being, expresses himself in the form of a created being. The two ground and form meet in the human beauty of Beatrice. For Balthasar, Beatrice, formed by God as the poet's eternal beloved, is therefore the Christ form for Dante, having without the same degree of reality as other saints. There is then no allegory or symbol. Here we are simply dealing with the laws of the communio sanctorum. This fact constitutes the foundation of the Divine Comedy. It is existential theology. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, in the third and fourth parts of this paper, I turned to Mandanas' contrasting scholastic account of Dante and beauty, an account Balthasar abandons, and with it I would suggest a more traditional and Thomistic understanding of the relationship between natural and supernatural beauty. I would be very grateful, though, for any comments in or out with this session on my contextual reappraisal of Balthasar's contentious understanding of Dante, as well as on its relationship to the development and articulation of his new vision for theology, his theological aesthetics. Thank you.